She thought her secrets were safe. But when the cameras started rolling, her perfect world began to crumble. What happens when betrayal meets cold, calculated revenge? Stay until the end to see justice served. It started with perfume. Not the usual vanilla and citrus scent Miranda wore for years, but something darker, muskier, seductive in a way that didn't fit her usual choices. I noticed it one evening when she got home from a work meeting that had run suspiciously late. "New perfume?" I asked, leaning in as she kissed my cheek, her lips warm but oddly distant. "Yeah, got it as a sample at the mall," she replied too quickly, shrugging off her coat. Miranda had never been good at lying, not to me anyway. But I let it slide. Maybe she was embarrassed about splurging. That was a thing, right? Couples sometimes grew secretive about little indulgences. Still, something felt off. It wasn't just the perfume. Over the past 2 months, her habits had shifted. She'd taken a sudden interest in yoga classes, though she'd never been the type to exercise regularly. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around, was now glued to her side, always face down. And those late-night work meetings? They'd gone from monthly to twice a week. "You're paranoid," I told myself, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel one evening. Her smile was radiant, her eyes soft with love. She'd never, but the cracks were growing. One night, after she'd gone to bed early claiming a headache, I picked up her coat from where she'd thrown it over the back of the chair. Something in the pocket caught my attention, a hotel keycard. My heart slammed into my ribs. When did she? Why would she? The questions raced through my mind, each one more sickening than the last. I didn't confront her that night. I sat in the living room, staring at that damned keycard, feeling the first cold sliver of betrayal slide into my chest. "Don't jump to conclusions," I whispered aloud, though the silence of the room made it sound absurd. But deep down, I knew. A part of me had known for weeks. I slipped the key card back into her coat and resolved to dig deeper. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was survival. The next morning, Miranda was gone early, off to another yoga class. I stood at the kitchen counter, swirling my coffee, staring at the coat rack like it held answers. I needed a plan. Later that day, I installed a small GPS tracker on her car. It wasn't hard to find. A sleek device I ordered online, no larger than a matchbox. By the time she got back from her yoga class, everything was in place. For the first few days, there was nothing unusual. She went to the yoga studio, the grocery store, even her parents' house. It almost made me doubt myself, made me feel like the paranoid husband I swore I'd never become. Then Friday rolled around. Her car didn't go to the yoga studio or the grocery store. Parked at a boutique hotel on the edge of town. The same hotel logo as the keycard I'd found. I stared at my phone, watching the blinking dot on the tracker app, bile rising in my throat. She stayed there for 2 hours. 2 hours. When she came home, she was glowing, her cheeks flushed, her hair tied in a messy bun that somehow looked perfect. She kissed me on the cheek, lingering just a little too long, as if compensating for something. "How was yoga?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Great," she said with a smile, brushing past me. That was when I knew for sure. That night, while she showered, I unlocked her phone. It wasn't hard. Her password was still our wedding date. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her texts, scanning for something, anything, that would confirm my suspicions. It didn't take long. A series of messages from someone saved as Alyssa, work. Alyssa, can't stop thinking about earlier. You were incredible. Miranda, you're bad for me. I can't resist. Alyssa, next week, same place? My vision blurred. Alyssa wasn't a woman. I clicked on the contact photo. It was a man, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair, and an aura of confidence that oozed arrogance. I recognized him. His name was Nathan, and he was Miranda's new boss. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the counter. Upstairs, the sound of the shower running drowned out the storm of rage and humiliation building inside me. I wanted to storm up there, demand an explanation, scream at her until she admitted the truth. But something held me back. No, not yet. I needed more. After that night, I became someone I barely recognized. Every spare moment was consumed by tracking her movements, poring over her phone records, and piecing together the web of lies she'd spun. The GPS tracker was gold. For the next 2 weeks, I watched her car ping across the city. The hotel, Nathan's office, even a wine bar downtown. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Her texts were just as damning. She and Nathan were bold, reckless even. He'd send her things like, "Last night was unforgettable," and "You look so good when you're lying to him." Miranda would respond with emojis or flirty one-liners that made me sick. But the final straw came when I hacked into her email. At first, it was routine messages, work updates, newsletters, the usual. Then I found the hidden folder labeled Personal. Inside were photos. Photos of her and Nathan together. At the hotel. At the beach. At his house. In some of them, she was wearing the lingerie I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. My hands shook as I scrolled through each image, a mix of rage and despair pounding in my chest. She didn't just betray me. She flaunted it. She was living a second life right under my nose, and Nathan wasn't just her lover. He was her escape. The next day, I met with a lawyer. "Mr. Turner," she said after I laid out my findings, "you have a strong case for fault-based divorce. Adultery is one of the few legal grounds in this state." I nodded, unable to speak. "Do you have evidence?" she asked. "I do." My voice was cold, emotionless. "And I'm going to get more." That night, I set up hidden cameras in our home. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in the bedroom. Felt invasive, wrong even, but I needed everything on record. If she brought Nathan here, I wanted to see it. And she did. 2 days later, while I was working late, Nathan showed up. The cameras captured everything. The way she greeted him at the door with a kiss. The way they laughed over wine on the couch. The way I couldn't watch the footage in its entirety. It was too much. But I had what I needed. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the smugness, the audacity, the way they carried on as if I didn't exist. They thought I was a fool. But they were about to learn otherwise. The evidence I gathered was overwhelming. GPS logs, screenshots of explicit texts, photos of them together, and hours of footage from the hidden cameras. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. But I wasn't just preparing for a divorce. I was preparing for retribution. I began to see the full extent of her betrayal. Nathan wasn't just her boss. He was a man with influence, a network of connections, and a taste for power. He flaunted his wealth and confidence, and Miranda seemed intoxicated by it. She wasn't the same woman I'd married, but perhaps she never was. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about how little she thought of me. Miranda had always said she loved stability, reliability, and honesty. Qualities I prided myself on. Now it was clear she had traded them for thrills, lies, and luxury. I decided it was time to act. First, I secured my finances. I opened a new bank account in my name, rerouting my direct deposits and pulling funds from our shared savings account. I canceled credit cards she might use, ensuring that she wouldn't be able to access my resources. Next, I contacted a private investigator to verify and document everything I'd found. Though I had enough evidence on my own, I wanted a professional touch to ensure there were no holes in my case. I needed everything to be airtight. Finally, I started plotting my next move. This wasn't going to be a quiet exit. I wasn't going to slink away and let her continue this life she had built on my trust. She would feel the consequences of her choices, and so would Nathan. My plan began to take shape. It wasn't enough to leave her. I needed her to understand the weight of her betrayal. She needed to feel the pain, humiliation, and loss that I had felt over the past weeks. Each step of my revenge was methodical, calculated. I wasn't going to rush this. If I'd learned one thing from their arrogance, it was that the sweetest victories come to those who are patient. With my plan in place, I began to dismantle Miranda's life piece by piece. The first step was subtle, something she wouldn't notice immediately. I accessed her phone account, a joint service under my name, and disabled her data temporarily. It wasn't much, but it sent her scrambling, trying to figure out why her connection was spotty. While she dealt with that, I moved on to her email. Using the passwords I had already discovered, I locked her out of her accounts, ensuring she couldn't access the damning messages or photos she had saved. These were safely stored on my devices now, categorized and ready for legal use. I also informed her yoga studio, the place she claimed to frequent, about the affair. It wasn't difficult to frame it as a harmless inquiry about Nathan visiting her during sessions. While I didn't accuse outright, the insinuation was clear, and it spread through the tight-knit group of instructors and members. Miranda would no longer find solace there. I worked behind the scenes with the private investigator, who uncovered a history of Nathan using his power to manipulate women. Miranda wasn't the first. This information became a critical piece of my strategy, not just for personal revenge but for ensuring he faced professional ruin. Once all the pieces were in place, I filed for divorce. My lawyer, armed with the evidence, ensured the case would be swift and devastating. Miranda would lose the house, the joint savings, and her claim to any spousal support. I didn't tell her. I let her live in ignorance while the legal machinery turned. It wasn't time to reveal my hand yet. The silence made her comfortable, unaware of the storm building beneath her feet. Nathan wasn't spared either. I sent an anonymous tip to his company, attaching just enough evidence of his affair with Miranda to cause a stir. The board of directors wouldn't ignore the blatant misuse of company resources for personal escapades. It was a slow, simmering chaos, and I relished every moment. I began to notice changes in Miranda. She grew quieter, distracted. The network of lies she had built was beginning to fray at the edges, and I watched with satisfaction as her perfect facade started to crack. It didn't take long for the weight of my actions to start pressing down on Miranda's life. The first sign came when she tried to use one of our joint credit cards and found it declined. I had already transferred most of the money into an account she couldn't touch, leaving her with barely enough to cover groceries. Her frustration was palpable, though she tried to mask it with indifference. I watched her scramble, making frantic calls to the bank while pretending everything was fine. Nathan, too, wasn't faring well. My anonymous tip to his company had been perfectly timed. I knew from the investigator that his affair with Miranda wasn't his first indiscretion, and the board of directors wasn't happy. Whispers about an internal investigation spread through his office like wildfire. Meanwhile, I prepared the next stage. Using the footage from the hidden cameras, I sent an untraceable package to Nathan's wife. Inside were printed photos, screenshots of text exchanges, and a USB drive with select clips of his visits to my home. Nathan's wife, a poised and influential woman, wouldn't take this betrayal quietly. I knew she would confront him with precision and rage, forcing his personal life to unravel alongside his professional one. At home, Miranda was becoming more erratic. Her perfect routine began to falter. She spent more time staring at her phone, her confidence replaced with unease. She must have felt the shift in Nathan, too, as his texts became less frequent and more terse. When she asked me about the finances one evening, I feigned confusion, telling her I hadn't noticed anything unusual. Her face betrayed her frustration, but she didn't press further. The beauty of my plan was its subtlety. Miranda and Nathan didn't realize they were being targeted. They assumed their own negligence or bad luck was to blame. That was the art of it, to make them destroy themselves while I simply guided the process. Nathan's company finally placed him on administrative leave pending the investigation. I knew it was only a matter of time before his career crumbled completely. As for Miranda, her world was shrinking. The luxurious life she had built around Nathan's charm and my reliability was collapsing like a house of cards. I didn't confront her yet. That would come later at the perfect moment. For now, I savored watching the chaos unfold, knowing it was only the beginning. Miranda began to retreat into herself. Her vibrant energy, the confidence she carried when she walked through the door after a yoga session, was gone. She spent more time in our bedroom, the phone always in her hand, the tension in her posture almost tangible. Nathan's texts had slowed to a trickle, and I could see the frustration etched on her face as she stared at the screen. Their affair, once passionate and reckless, was beginning to wither under the weight of my interference. At work, Nathan's problems deepened. The internal investigation uncovered not just his affair with Miranda, but discrepancies in expense accounts and misuse of company resources. It wasn't enough to terminate him outright yet, but his reputation was now in shreds. I kept my distance, both physically and emotionally. Miranda noticed, of course. She'd glance at me across the dinner table, her eyes searching for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe the man who once adored her. But I gave her nothing. She started reaching out to her friends, seeking validation and support, but her calls were met with hesitance. Word of her affair had spread quietly through our social circles. The yoga studio gossip I had seeded was working its magic, and Miranda was beginning to realize just how alone she was. One evening, she tried to bridge the gap between us. She cooked dinner, something elaborate, reminiscent of the meals she used to make when we first married. She lit candles, played soft music, and sat across from me with an almost nervous energy. I let her talk, nodding at the right moments, pretending to care. She spoke about wanting to reconnect, how we'd been distant lately, and how she missed us. Her performance was almost convincing, but I saw through it. This wasn't love or remorse. It was fear. Fear of losing the stability I provided, the safety net she thought would always be there. I didn't respond to her attempts. Instead, I excused myself early, leaving her alone at the table. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across her face as I turned away, her expression a mix of frustration and defeat. The isolation I had engineered was working. She was losing Nathan, her friends, and now me. Her carefully curated world was crumbling, and there was no one left to save her. Miranda's unraveling was becoming more visible. She stopped pretending everything was fine. Her once immaculate appearance was slipping, dark circles under her eyes, her hair thrown into messy knots. Even her tone changed, clipped and defensive whenever she spoke. Nathan, too, was breaking under the pressure. My investigator sent updates on his situation. The company had formally suspended him. Without his salary, his lavish lifestyle was under threat, and his wife had filed for divorce, armed with the evidence I'd provided. The beauty of it was that Nathan and Miranda still didn't know how tightly they were being watched. Their relationship, once built on stolen moments and secrecy, was now strained and filled with mistrust. Miranda had begun calling Nathan incessantly, but his responses were terse and infrequent. One afternoon, I watched her pace the living room, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was tense as she argued, the words spilling out in fragmented frustration. Nathan must have said something that hit a nerve because she threw her phone across the room, the shattering sound echoing through the house. She sat on the floor, head in her hands, the weight of her crumbling world pressing down on her. I stood silently in the hallway, unseen, savoring the moment. But I wasn't done yet. I sent an anonymous email to the HR department at Miranda's company, attaching snippets of her texts with Nathan. Nothing explicit, but enough to hint at impropriety. Her company prided itself on professionalism, and I knew this would trigger whispers and speculation. Miranda started working from home more, claiming illness. It wasn't long before her manager suggested a leave of absence to recover. It was a polite way of saying she wasn't wanted there for now. The isolation I had orchestrated was nearly complete. She had no friends left to confide in, no job to distract her, and Nathan had all but disappeared. The confident, composed woman I once knew was a shadow of herself, her world reduced to the four walls of the house she had betrayed me in. I didn't confront her about the affair. Not yet. Letting her sit in the wreckage of her choices was far more satisfying than any argument could have been. Every day, I watched her crack a little more, the perfect mirror of her life fracturing under the weight of everything I had set in motion. Miranda's facade finally shattered. Her life had been reduced to a cycle of sleepless nights, unanswered calls, and frantic attempts to regain control. The woman who once radiated confidence was now a ghost, wandering the house in silence. I could tell she was starting to suspect that someone was behind her unraveling. She'd glance over her shoulder, her movements tentative, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. She no longer looked at me with defiance but with quiet desperation, like a drowning swimmer clutching at air. Nathan had cut her off entirely. He wasn't responding to her texts or calls, and my investigator confirmed that he had moved out of his home to avoid his wife's wrath. His career was over, his finances in ruin, and he was now a pariah in every circle he'd once dominated. Miranda, meanwhile, was flailing. She spent hours on her laptop, trying to find new job opportunities, but the rumors about her unprofessional relationship with Nathan had followed her. Each rejection email chipped away at her resolve. One evening, she sat at the dining table, her head resting in her hands, staring at a glass of wine she hadn't touched. The house was eerily quiet except for the ticking of the clock. She hadn't spoken to me all day, and I hadn't offered anything in return. She finally broke her silence. Her voice was shaky, almost inaudible, as she mumbled something about needing to fix things. But there was nothing left to fix. Her affair had destroyed everything. Her career, her reputation, her relationship with Nathan, and whatever trust had once existed between us. That night, I left a printed photo on the kitchen counter, a picture of her and Nathan, taken from one of their hotel rendezvous. Beneath it, I wrote a single word: why? I didn't wait for her to find it. I went to bed early, leaving her to face the evidence alone. The next morning, she was gone when I woke up. Her car was still in the driveway, but her purse and phone were missing. I didn't panic. This was the next step, the point where the walls closed in and she had no escape. Hours later, she returned, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't say where she'd been, and I didn't ask. I simply watched as she retreated upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind her. She was falling apart, and I wasn't going to stop it. Miranda's breaking point came faster than I expected. Days after she found the photo on the counter, she finally cracked. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. Her appearance was disheveled. The sharp, elegant woman I had married now looked hollow and fragile, as if the weight of her own lies had physically diminished her. She didn't start with an apology, and I wasn't surprised. Miranda had never been one to admit fault easily. Instead, she spoke haltingly about mistakes and how things got out of hand. She avoided specifics, as if her vague admissions could erase the months of betrayal. I didn't respond, letting her words hang in the air, heavy and meaningless. She finally confessed to the affair, though it was more of an acknowledgement than an apology. She admitted to meeting Nathan at the hotel, to lying about her yoga classes, and to the texts and emails I had already seen. But she framed it all as a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment caused by the stresses of our marriage. Her voice cracked as she begged me to understand, to give her a chance to make things right. She spoke about wanting to fix our marriage, to rebuild what we had. But the words felt empty, like a script she had rehearsed without conviction. I let her finish, my silence unnerving her. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost detached. I told her I already knew everything, that I had known for weeks, maybe months. Her face crumbled as the reality of my words sank in. I laid out the evidence methodically, each piece a dagger to her already fragile composure. The photos, the texts, the GPS logs. I even mentioned the hidden cameras, watching as her face turned ghostly pale. She didn't deny any of it. How could she? The proof was irrefutable. Instead, she broke down, her tears spilling onto the table as she begged for forgiveness. She promised to cut ties with Nathan, to do whatever it took to make amends. But her words meant nothing to me. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. This was about justice, about ensuring she felt the full weight of what she had done. I stood and walked away, leaving her sobbing at the table. There was no need for theatrics or anger. The silence between us was punishment enough. After Miranda's confession, the house became a mausoleum of our failed marriage. She tried to reach out to me in small ways, a forced smile in the mornings, an offer to cook dinner, or a quiet good night as I turned off the lights. I ignored her, The next step in my plan was to sever every tie that bound us. I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce filing, making sure the evidence of her infidelity was front and center. With no job and no financial leverage, Miranda had little ground to stand on. While she wallowed in guilt and uncertainty, I quietly set my life in motion. I found a new place to live, a modern apartment on the other side of town, far removed from the memories of our marriage. I'd already transferred enough money to ensure I could start fresh without her dragging me down. The locks on the house were changed, and I began moving my things into storage. I wanted to leave no trace of myself in the place we once called home. Nathan, meanwhile, was spiraling. The fallout from his affair with Miranda had obliterated his career. His wife's divorce proceedings were ruthless, and the rumors about his indiscretions left him a pariah among his colleagues and friends. His name, once synonymous with power and influence, now carried the bitter taste of scandal. Miranda seemed to grasp the depth of her isolation. Her attempts to reconcile grew more desperate. She started writing me letters, leaving them on my nightstand or slipping them under my office door. Each one was an apology, a plea for a second chance. But I didn't read them. I simply gathered them into a neat stack and threw them in the trash. She finally cornered me one evening, her voice trembling as she asked if there was any hope for us. She claimed to still love me, to want to fix what was broken. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her believe, just for an instant, that there was a chance. Then I told her about the divorce filing. I explained that I had already started the paperwork and that the evidence of her affair had ensured she wouldn't see a dime beyond what the law required. Her face crumbled. She tried to argue, to protest, but I was done listening. I walked out of the room, leaving her to sit in the wreckage of the life she'd destroyed. The final act of my revenge wasn't meant to be private. Miranda's betrayal had been a public humiliation for me, even if most people didn't know it yet. I intended to change that. The morning the divorce papers were served, I emailed a carefully crafted letter to our closest friends and family. It wasn't vengeful in tone, it was factual, almost clinical. I outlined the timeline of Miranda's affair with Nathan, attached sanitized screenshots of texts, and included details about how she had brought him into our home. I explained that I wasn't looking for sympathy or to make anyone choose sides. I simply wanted everyone to know the truth, as I wouldn't tolerate lies or speculation. The reaction was swift. Miranda's phone buzzed constantly as messages poured in. Friends she thought she could lean on either distanced themselves or lashed out in shock and disappointment. Her parents, once supportive, called repeatedly, demanding answers she couldn't give. Her shame turned to anger when she realized what I had done. She confronted me, her voice shaking with rage, accusing me of trying to ruin her life. I didn't argue. I simply told her the truth. She had ruined it herself. But the letter wasn't just for Miranda. It was for Nathan too. His wife forwarded the email to his company's board of directors, who were already knee-deep in their investigation. It was the final nail in his professional coffin. He was officially terminated, his reputation in tatters. The fallout spread quickly. In our circle, Miranda became a symbol of betrayal, her name spoken in hushed whispers or not at all. People avoided her, not out of malice but discomfort. She was a reminder of the ugliness that lay beneath polished exteriors. She retreated further into herself, rarely leaving the house, even for errands. I could see her struggling to hold onto any shred of dignity, but it was gone. I, on the other hand, felt a weight lifting. For the first time in months, I wasn't hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next blow. I had taken control, and the world now knew the truth. There was no turning back for Miranda or Nathan. Their choices had led them here, and I had simply ensured they faced the consequences. The divorce proceedings began swiftly. With the mountain of evidence I had presented, there was little Miranda could do to defend herself. Her lawyer attempted to argue for leniency, painting her as someone who had made a mistake in a strained marriage. But the judge wasn't swayed. The photos, texts, and videos were irrefutable. The affair was not just a fleeting indiscretion but a calculated betrayal that spanned months. Miranda's pleas for a fair division of assets fell flat. I was awarded the house, the majority of our shared savings, and sole possession of the car we had jointly financed. The judge's decision left Miranda with nothing but a small portion of what remained, a lifeline, but not enough to rebuild the comfortable life she had grown accustomed to. I saw her break in that courtroom. It wasn't the same as the tears she shed when she confessed or the desperate letters she wrote. This was raw, unfiltered devastation. She realized there was no escape from the consequences of her actions. Nathan, too, faced his reckoning. His wife's divorce settlement was brutal, leaving him with barely enough to cover his mounting debts. The fallout from his termination ensured he wouldn't find work in his field again. He had gone from a man of influence and power to one barely holding on. As the legal proceedings ended, I walked out of the courthouse feeling a sense of closure. There was no victory to celebrate, just the satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. Miranda approached me in the parking lot, her face pale and her eyes sunken. She tried to apologize again, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she never meant for it to go this far, that she had hoped we could find a way back to each other. I didn't respond. I simply walked away, leaving her standing alone under the harsh midday sun. The days following the divorce proceedings were quiet, but I wasn't finished. Miranda's life was in ruins, but there was one last move to make. Nathan had vanished from the public eye after losing his job and his wife, retreating into obscurity to avoid further scrutiny. Miranda, still reeling from the loss of her financial stability, had moved into a small, run-down apartment. She was surviving, but barely. I sent the final piece of evidence to Nathan directly. A carefully curated package of documents and photos that painted Miranda's role in their affair as one of manipulation and self-interest. I highlighted her texts where she toyed with him, spoke of how easily she could lie to me, and even referred to their relationship as an escape rather than love. The aim wasn't to mend fences between them. Quite the opposite. Nathan needed to see that she had used him just as much as he had used her. It worked. A week later, I heard from my investigator that Nathan had confronted Miranda. Witnesses said it was explosive. Shouting in a public cafe, accusations flying back and forth. Whatever connection they had left was obliterated in that moment. Miranda was now utterly alone. Her lover had turned on her. Her friends had abandoned her. And her once perfect life was nothing but a memory. The final touch came when I sent her a letter. Not a note of reconciliation or regret, but a statement of finality. I thanked her for teaching me the harshest lesson of my life. Trust is fragile, and betrayal unforgivable. I wished her well, knowing full well it was a hollow sentiment. It wasn't about kindness. It was about closure, my closure. I had no more anger left for Miranda. She had become a cautionary tale, not an enemy. And I felt nothing but indifference as I sealed the envelope and sent it off, ensuring she would know there was no path back to me. With the final act complete, I stepped into a life I hadn't known in years. One without Miranda. The house, once filled with tension and betrayal, became a sanctuary. I removed every trace of her, the photos, the clothes she left behind, even the lingering scent of her perfume. It was a cleansing, both literal and symbolic. For the first time, I could breathe. The scars of her betrayal were deep, but they didn't define me. I threw myself into my work, hobbies, and friendships I had neglected during my marriage. Slowly, I began to rebuild. Not just my life, but my sense of self. People around me offered sympathy or curiosity, but I didn't share the details of what had happened. The public unveiling had been for Miranda and Nathan's reckoning, not mine. I chose instead to move forward quietly, letting time and distance heal the wounds. Miranda, from what little I heard, had disappeared from social circles entirely. She moved again, this time out of the city. Nathan's downfall was just as thorough. He remained unemployed and untouchable, living in the shadow of his disgrace. Their worlds had burned, and I walked away from the ashes unscathed. Freedom was a strange feeling at first, like stepping into sunlight after years in darkness. I realized how much of myself I had given to a woman who had never truly deserved it. But with each passing day, I reclaimed more of who I was and who I wanted to be. The revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, and now she had. But I refused to let her betrayal define the rest of my life. I learned the most valuable lesson from this entire ordeal. Some losses are blessings in disguise. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I looked ahead with clarity. The life I was building now wasn't tainted by lies or manipulation. It was mine, and for the first time in years I felt whole.